Hi everyone, welcome to this Tableau Prep user group. We're going to kick off now. We've given it a few minutes for everyone to join the session, so we'll get things moving along. If this is your first Tableau Prep user group, then just a little bit about me, who runs and hosts the sessions. I'm Jack Parry. I am a consultant at the Information Lab in London. I started working with Tableau Prep a few years ago now, and figured that it would be quite nice to have a space where people could come and present about Tableau Prep and share their user stories and watch the tool develop, given that at most Tableau user groups that I went to, the sessions were often on desktop and server. So it's quite nice to have a space just for Tableau Prep. You can connect with me on Twitter or LinkedIn if you'd like to, and you can give feedback on the sessions or anything like that. And I would also like to apologize for my voice today, because it's not in the best way after going to Portugal on Saturday for the Champions League final, but hopefully it lasts the session. Just a few housekeeping things from me before we get going. This session is being recorded and it will be posted on Tableau's YouTube channel tomorrow, probably. It might go up tonight, but I doubt it. So if you want to share it with anyone after the session, or you would feel like you need to drop off for any reason, you have meetings or stuff like that, then please feel free to do so. Anything else? So if you have any questions for the speakers during the session, you can put those in the Q&A box, please, and not in the chat. We'll be monitoring the Q&A box throughout the session. We won't be monitoring the chat so much, so any questions, put them in there. The resources from the speakers will be shared with you as well after a session, so if there's anything you want from there, like prep flows and things like that, we can share them with you. And I think that is about it. So just a couple of other things that aren't related to Zoom. If you'd like to get involved, with some Tableau Prep training, then you can do so with the Information Lab. So we run these sessions called Thursday Training at 3, which is free to attend. And we run a Tableau Prep learning path. So each week the sessions build upon one another. So we'll start off with a beginner session, moving on to an intermediate session the week after, and then it finally goes to a more advanced technical session in the third and final week. That next learning path actually starts on the 3rd of June, so in 2 days' time, and that is 3 p.m. BST, so London time. The link to join the session is there in the PowerPoint slides, but once I finish speaking and Kate has started presenting, then I'll put all these links in the chat so you can get to those. We'd also like to have some input from you on the sessions. It's always good to hear what people may have for some suggestions, because when we've asked in the past, people have come up with some great ideas that we've never really thought about before. So whether that's exploring like a particular business use case for using Tableau Prep, or some tips and tricks you'd like to learn about, then you can fill out this Google form. Again, I'll put that in the chat. Once I'm done speaking, you can fill that out. And also, if you'd like to speak at a future session, then you can also make that clear on the form, because we're always looking for new speakers to come and present and share their ideas. So if you have any ideas or want to speak, is this now sharing the presenter view again? Has it swapped? Is that better? Okay, I'm not sure what happened there. Sorry about that. They swapped earlier as well. Anyway, yeah, if you'd like to speak at a future session or you've got any ideas but don't want to speak and you just want to share them with us and we can try and get someone to speak on that topic, then that's also fine. So onto the speakers themselves. We've got Kate Brown and Jonathan Drummey with me here today. I'm really excited for both of these talks because I know these two are great speakers and users of Tableau Prep. They've both presented at this user group before. Kate's going to be comparing her experience with Tableau Prep and Power Query, which I think will be fascinating. And Jonathan is going to talk us through the wizardry of producing mapping tables in Tableau Prep. I'll leave them to go into further details about their talks. That is all from me. So I'll now hand over to Kate to talk about Tableau Prep and Power Query.
Great, thanks, Jack. And I'm going to share my screen. And let's get rid of that. And great. So as Jack said, I'm Kate Brown. I have presented at the Tableau Prep user group meeting before. And today I'm going to talk with you about Tableau Prep and Power Query and how I have dabbled a little bit with Power Query. So a little bit about me. I'm a business support and analytics manager. I live just outside of Boston, Massachusetts. And on a daily basis, I'm in SQL, Tableau Desktop, and Tableau Prep. I'm also one of the co-leaders of SportsBiz Sunday. And I'm also a big fan of Tableau Prep and Desktop. I use Prep a lot for SportsBiz Sunday, and I've actually dabbled a little bit with Power Query to help generate our data sets for that too. You know, outside of work-related things, I love to travel, and I can't wait until I can travel internationally again. And this is just a picture of one of my favorite places that I've visited, which was I spent a week on Inishmore, which is one of the Aran Islands, and that's walking down from Dún Aengus. If you've never been there before, I highly recommend it. It is an amazing place. And then also you'll see, you know, my links. I'm on Twitter, and if you follow me on Twitter, you know that I love golf. I think I probably tweet about golf more than I do Tableau. And you'll also be seeing a lot of new puppy pictures. Luckily, my puppy just fell asleep. She was biting my toes right before the presentation, but she's happily snoring away now. And you can hit me up on Twitter, LinkedIn, and my blog is Fairways and Viz. And I do have a fair amount of Tableau Prep content out there, including, you know, going from Prep to SQL and just how I've solved some things using Tableau Prep. All right, so what I did, sorry for jumping around, was I love prepping data. So if you're not familiar with prepping data, it's a weekly challenge. It was started by Carl Alchin and Jonathan Allenby back in 2019 to help people learn and practice Tableau Prep. The way that it works is once a week, the data preppers, which are Carl, Jenny Martin, and Tom Prouse, they'll provide a data set and a challenge for you to solve with Tableau Prep. And then the following week, there'll be a solution where they'll walk through the flow, and there'll be a video solution as well. And the challenges range in difficulty. So if you're brand new to Prep, these are a great place to start. If you've been using Prep for a while, these are also really good to kind of keep up your skills and keep up with the improvements and enhancements in Prep. And you can find the challenges and other great posts on cleaning and prepping data on the site. So it's just preppinddata.blogspot.com. So one of the things that I've been dabbling a little bit with is Power Query in Excel. So not in Power BI. I don't have a Power BI license. I don't really use Power BI, but there is Power Query embedded in Excel. And I felt like I needed to kind of understand how that tool worked, how I could use it, what does it do? So I thought the best way for me to do that was really to take one of these prepping data challenges. So I have right in front of us, this is the requirements for week 18 of 2021. And then what I wanted to do was solve it in Prep. So I've got the logic and how I want to approach it. and then see how I would replicate that in Power Query and what I can learn about both of the tools. So what I'm going to do is I'm really just going to jump in. I do have, as Jack said, these slides will be available afterwards. And what I did here was just really kind of the steps in prep and the steps in Power Query. So you'd have those as a reference. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually close out of here and I'm going to jump in to right here. And so this is the week 18. So if you're not familiar with it, you're going to have the challenge here. There'll be a file provided here. So I just download the file. And then these will be the requirements, or what ultimately, what are the steps that you need to take to solve this challenge. The other thing that I also love is that they provide the output on a weekly basis. So you can always go, am I right? Am I wrong? Where did I mess up? How am I comparing to what the solution is? So these are going to be the steps that we're going to follow. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of jump back and forth between this and prep and Power Query so we can see what we need to do. So the first thing that we want to do is input the data. And I've got these pre-built flows in the Excel sheet. So if anyone wants these afterwards, just let me know and we can do that. I'm not going to walk through how to connect to a source in prep, but I've already established my connection here. So here's my input. And the first thing that we needed to do was to create the complete date. So what we want to do is we're going to add on a number of days to the scheduled date to get the complete date. So when we look at that, we've got our schedule date here. We have a field here. I'm going to just click here. So we've got a field right here where we've got complete days to schedule. And what I'm going to do is just a date add function, right? So we know this is our schedule date. We know how many days it took to complete it. So if we just create a calculated field where we're going to do a date add, so we're adding days to our schedule date. And then that's going to give us our complete date. Pretty straightforward, just a date add. You've probably done a date add in desktop if you've never used prep before. And so if I jump over to Power Query, this is going to be the Excel file. And what I'm going to do is just go sure that I can get back there. So when you import data from Power Query, I will show you this because this may be new for some folks. But what I did is I know that I'm working with an Excel file, so I went to get data from workbook. And then if I just go to my downloads, I'd grab week 18. And then this is going to establish a connection. And then what you'll have here is the data source. And then if you click on this transform data, this is going to take you into the steps that I'm going to show you. So this is actually kind of that prep flow for Power Query of where you would come in and create these calculations. I'm just going to back out of here and close and discard because we've already got this in here. So I'm just going to edit the queries. So once you've established something, what you can do is show your queries and connections, come into edit. And I will preface all of this that I am by no means a Power Query expert. This is new to me, so there may be easier ways to do this in prep and in Power Query. It's just how the logic in my brain worked out. So feel free, if you know a better way to do this, feel free to throw that in the chat. But essentially what this will do here too is it's also going to track your changes similar to prep in a clean step or any step that you can see what the changes you're making. So what I did here was I added a column. So there's a menu over here to add a column. And if I edit the settings, what you'll see is similar to prep, we're doing a date add. So we're adding a number of days. So we're adding to the scheduled date the number of days from completed to scheduled. And that will give us our complete date. Pretty straightforward. I renamed it to rename the column. You just double click here, name it. And then I changed this to a date type. So this was really, the first step of what I did in Power Query. And then here, what I did was actually I loaded this to a worksheet. There are different things that you can do in Power Query where you load it just as a connection and it saves the steps that you did, or you can load it to a worksheet and it will actually create it as a tab on your file. So I did that because brand new to me, I don't really know what I'm doing yet. So I like to have a reference here. The next thing that we need to do is we're really gonna kind of split this so you can see what we want to do is really branch off, and we're gonna work with some dates to get different date fields, and then we're gonna end up joining that back. So what we want to do is we actually want to get the difference between scope and build and delivery. And if I jump back over to prep, because I will say I'm definitely biased to prep. I really like prep. I like the visual aspect of it. It's easier for me to see exactly what's going on. You'll see right here, we've got build, deliver, and scope as a task. So what that says to me is essentially, I want to do a pivot somewhere. I want to reshape my data. So I'm going to be able to do date calculations off of that. So we're going to be looking at these and we're going to pivot these right here. We even got a nice little clue, and then we'll want to rename these fields. So in prep, what I did was I added a branch, a clean step, and I just kept the project, the subproject, the task, and the complete date. And I did that just by clicking these columns, doing the right click. So hopefully people are familiar with this. If you just do a right click, you can keep only. Pretty easy to do, just to pick the ones that you want. And then I inserted a pivot step. And for this pivot step, I'm going to do a rows to columns, and I'm going to take my task and I'm going to do the min of my complete date. I know only you'll have one complete date per task, so I'm good to use that min here. And then that will give me my data reshaped. So now I know this is the date it was delivered. This was the date, for the scope was completed. This was the date that the build was completed. So right in this pivot step, you can also do calculations. When I started learning prep, I really kind of had a step for each thing. But since I've gotten more familiar with prep and more comfortable with it, I try and consolidate my flows in as few steps as possible. Sometimes it's not always easy, and sometimes when they're more complicated, I may break things out a little bit more. But if you look right here, you can see I made 2 changes. And so what I did here were just those date calculations. So I'm doing a date diff, really similar to desktop. We're going to do a date diff in days between scope and build. And then we're going to do build to delivery time. So then to do this in Power Query, what I did was I actually, I used this as my starting point. So this was the one that I loaded. And what you can do is from table or range. And then that's going to load the data that's in this table right here. So I've already created my create date. And now what I want to do is I'm going to edit this. And this is going to be where I was like, okay, I have no idea how I want to approach this in Power Query, but I know in prep, really what I wanted to do was a pivot. So here, what I did very similar to prep was I selected the columns that I wanted. And instead of doing a keep only, what I did was if you right click here, you can do remove other columns. So same thing, just different way. Instead of keep only, you're going to remove everything that you don't want. So that left me with project, subproject, task, owner, and complete date. Here I left owner in. I could have left it in prep. Probably should have just taken it out here to keep it consistent, but I missed that. And then I know again from, going through prep first, I want to reshape and have my scope with the complete date. So I started poking around and seeing what can I actually do. And there's a pivot option here. So what I can do is actually pivot these columns. So if I edit the settings here, what you're going to see is I'm going to pivot these. When you pick up the pivot tool, you're going to pick like what's the value that you want to show down here underneath the new headers. So we're going to do the complete date. Something that's kind of cool about Power Query is in prep, I had to do the min of the date. Here, I don't have to pick an aggregate. So there are options of what I can do, and then I can also pick don't aggregate. So don't aggregate just is going to give me the value. So slightly different than prep, but the same concept on how you want to reshape it. And then here, what I needed to do was create those time fields, right? So I needed to duplicate the calculated field that I did in prep. And you can do that by adding a column. And so we'll just edit this column. And using a formula here, similar to prep, when you do a calculated field, you're going to have a way to create calculated fields. So here we're just doing the duration in days between build and scope. Now this took me a while because I was looking for a date function, something that started with date. And then I was like, all right, let me just look at everything. And I saw this duration in days. Okay, and then I've got these 2 times, and now I'm going to just jump back over here because what we then need to do is we need to pivot these back so we've got a task field and a complete date again. So in prep, the way to do this is I'm just going to add another pivot right after this step, and I'm going to do an unpivot essentially, or I'm going to do a columns to rows, and I'm going to collapse my data back down. So I've got a column for the task and then a column for the complete date. And then in Power Query, I'm going to do very similar. If we come back over to transform, you're going to have an unpivot option. And if I unpivot this, it just moves these back. So you're going to see the exact same thing. So here's my attribute or my task, and then here's the value. For this one, I actually did the close and load just the connection. So I kept just these steps essentially and didn't load the results to a worksheet. So I'm going to close out of this and then we're going to jump back over here. Tom, Jack, am I doing okay on time?
Yeah, you're all fine. Don't worry.
Okay, cool. If I run long, just tell me to speed it up a little bit. So now we've got this kind of reshaped, and now what we need to do is we need to add these results back to our main query. So again, if you've done any prepping data challenges, you've probably run into something where you've done the join back to your main data set. So I added a join step here, and we're going to join my step of initial clean back to my unpivoted tasks. And if we look at our join settings, I'm going to join on project task and subproject. And then this will give me my final tidy step, and we've got all of the consolidated data. Now to do this in Power Query, what I did was I created this as a connection. So I created my project timelines. So that was this main one that I loaded. I did this as a connection only. And then here, what I did, and I want to just make sure I'm in the right place. Oh, I got to go back one, sorry. Let's go ahead and close. So I do edit here. It took me a little while to figure out how I was going to take my data and actually combine these back together. And if we come back here, there's this merge queries option. And what this merge queries is it's really essentially very similar to a join. The top part is always going to be the left. And then what you would do is you would pick what you want to join to it. So we want to join our pivot task complete step. So that's where I recreated, I created the scope build and build to deliver times. And then that was the 2 pivots. And then you've got different join types down here. For this one, we're okay doing an inner join. And to pick the columns that you want to join on, you're going to select them. So you're just going to highlight them, and we're going to do task and attribute. And then this will load those, and then you'll get that combined data set. So a merge is a join. And then when you think about it, your top one is always going to be your left, and then that would be your right section. So if we close out of this, discard and close, and then we go back over here, the next thing we need to do is we just need to see which weekday each task got completed on, because you want to know whether it's a weekend or not for the dashboard. So in prep, really easy to do. One thing I will say, if I just jump back over here, so I missed that. So let me edit this. Just see. So when you merge the fields in Power Query, what you'll get is here you're going to see this isn't going to look like this. It's going to be the little button is going to have 2 arrows on it. And when you click that, you can actually pick the fields that you want to include, which I kind of liked because in prep, you know, when we join 2, I have to go back and I have to remove, you know, the fields that I don't want to keep here. So these ones with the -1, right, are going to be duplicated because they're in both of my data sets. So that was one little thing that I thought was kind of nice, that I can pick what ones I want to do when I merge them. But here we're just going to do really 2 straightforward calculations. We're going to get our name. So I did a date name for weekday for our complete date. And then what I just did was I created a flag here just to say, is this a weekend? So I did a Boolean, if my complete day of the week, for me, Saturday, Sunday is a weekend. So I'm just going to say that's a weekend. And then that is my final data set here in prep. And then to do that here, what I'm going to do is edit this right here. And again, you'll see this is very similar, right? So this is a date function and it's a day of name of the week. And that's going to be my complete date. So that's going to give me the day. And then what I added what is called a conditional column. And this is really, it's kind of neat. It's basically like an if statement, but it's got drop downs for you to populate, so you don't actually have to write out the if statement. So I'm just saying, is this a weekend? So my complete day of the week equals Sunday or Saturday, then give me true, else give me false. So it gives you a little visual way to build an if statement. And then I just moved around my columns, and then there was my final data set in Power Query. So 2 different ways, you know, 2 different tools that you can do to solve it. For me, you know, I really wanted to understand, what can I use Power Query for? What do I want to use Prep for? And how do they both work? So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to jump back over to PowerPoint. And can everyone still see my screen? We good? Yes.
Yeah, you're all good. We can still
Okay,
see your
great.
screen.
Okay. I didn't have the screen share on my side, so I'm like, did I lose that? So really just some final thoughts on, you know, kind of just an initial view from my perspective is, you know, I think the more that I understand how other tools work, the better off I'm going to be. You know, I can see situations where I'll use a combination of Power Query and Prep to generate the data sets. And really it comes around something that I'm not going to get too much into here, but Spencer's got a great blog post out there on how you can use how you can do web scraping in Power Query. You don't need Power BI to do this. You can use the Power Query that I just showed you in Excel. I've used it for some of the Sports Biz Sunday data sets that I've had to produce, where I've scraped the data and then I've brought it into Prep to kind of clean it up, join it, and do any sort of manipulations that I want there. You know, things that I'll never get away from Prep for, you know, number one, publish right to a data source, right to the Tableau server. You know, that's huge. Not doing that with Power Query. Right back to database. I didn't see a way to do that in Power Query. I'm not saying that you can't, but nothing jumped out at me as that being possible. So I feel fairly confident saying that I don't think that you can do that. You know, I really personally love the visual flow and the visual indicators in Prep. You know, I think you know, when we look over here and we can see, you know, the histograms or the bars, just to see what our distributions look like, you know, to me, that's really helpful, especially when I'm starting with new data I don't know. I'll always bring it into Prep because it helps me get a sense of what's really happening in there. You know, I also love the ability to just click on a value just to see those rows with that, to get a really good sense of what's happening with my data. I love the double click just to edit a value. And really, I don't think I've seen a better tool in dealing with when you're not sure what type of join you want to do, where you can actually easily see the fallout and help you figure out, is it okay that those aren't coming in, those records? Yes, I definitely know I don't want those. Or wait, I think that I should have everything. Why when I change this to from an inner join to a left join, do I have all these records that don't have a match? So for me, I'm by no means abandoning prep for Power Query. I think Power Query has a use, but prep has my heart, that's for sure. So things that I do love about Power Query is the web scraping. There's an ability to remove the top rows really easily. This is one that I would love to see in prep, is the split functionality, where you can split from upper to lowercase, and you can split digit to non-digit just with a drop down. That's pretty nice. You can also fill up and down. So if you got those worksheets where you may have a value in a column and then blanks until the next value, you can use a fill up and down option. This locale option is really good. When I first brought in a CSV file for another prepping data that I was working with in Power Query, my dates were totally messed up because I'm in the US. What I didn't know was that I could actually, change it to a date, but I had to specify where the file was originated from. So the dates came in okay. That's a pretty handy option. And I like how you can, where I was talking about those fields, when you join or you merge in Power Query, I really like that you've got there the selection, to uncheck these fields that I don't want to bring in. It's just that, it's probably the same amount of clicks, but I don't have to select the ones that I don't want and then exclude them. I can just unclick them right in that same join step. So that's kind of my really intro level, kind of observations on Power Query and what I've learned. And it really helped me re-solidify my love of a lot of things in prep. So I'm going to stop sharing there and just see if there are any questions. I feel like I sped
have a
through
look
that.
at the Q&A, Kate. There may be a few in there that you want to answer. I've got some other ones as well. Thank you for sharing that. It's really interesting to see how you've got on with Power Query, and interesting for me, and I'm sure a lot of others who I've never opened up Power Query before. So it's interesting to see the inside of that as someone who's only used Tableau Prep, and I'm sure there are probably many others on here who are feeling the same.
Great. Jack, I can take some time and answer these offline. And I would definitely recommend, looking at the web scraping and then bringing that into prep. So.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, that's kind of what I'd written down to ask you. So yeah, okay. Well, fantastic. And thanks for sharing once again. We'll move on to Jonathan then.
Okay. So there was, Kate, are you still on?
I am, yep.
Okay, yeah. So there's one of the questions in the Q&A was about data volumes between Power Query and prep slowing down due to volumes. And the question was, do they both work about as quickly on big data sets for you?
That I don't know, because I've really just used the prepping data in Power Query, which tend to be some smaller data sets. So I'm not comfortable answering that.
Okay. Nope. And for me, I don't really use Power Query. I use Prep and Alteryx. I'm a more visual person that way. I do have a colleague who uses Power Query a lot. And with data volumes, if he's doing like writing out to Excel and things, there definitely are some performance issues that he runs into with Power Query as it gets into the hundreds and thousands or millions of rows and everything that's and joining multiple tables and everything. But that's primarily living in an Excel based world. So So big data is one of those terms. It's really variable. I know people for whom 10,000 records is big data, and then I know people for whom 10 billion records is big data. So that's about what we can do on that one. All right. So I will start presenting. So feel free to put things in the Q&A and everything. And let me share my screen. All right. So my presentation is about using prep to create reusable crosswalk or mapping tables. Just to do a quick introduction of me and what I do. So I work for a nonprofit called PATH. We have about 1,400 staff in 40 different countries. And we're in the public health space. So we do drug development, medical device development, health system strengthening, helping to set standards on data use and standards of care across the whole spectrum of public health. So with COVID, we've been doing a ton of work on different things. Most recently for me, I've been doing a lot of work around medical oxygen supplies for COVID because there's a real gap there. And so in my work, my job title is I'm a data visualization specialist, and I consult on different projects at PATH for building views and dashboards and doing data wrangling. And then I'll also do training and help run our Tableau infrastructure. And we're a grantee of the Tableau Foundation in our work. So with that, I have to be honest about that because I get free software through that. So when I was a kid, I loved Louis Armstrong for his voice and his trumpet playing, and he and Ella Fitzgerald sang the song "Let's Call the Whole Thing Off" by George Gershwin, which started out with like, "You say either and I say either, you say neither and I say neither, either, either, neither, neither, let's call the whole thing off." And then potato and potato and tomato and so on. And so there's this thing where we have different words for the same thing. So ultimately, these are synonyms. We have different terms that mean the same thing. And so there's this question as we're working in Tableau Prep or Tableau Desktop, kind of where do we do this matching to make things line up? So I'm going to do a short little demo here in Tableau Prep, but not of that one. I'm going to do this one. So I have this data set of World Bank list of economies. So it's classifying by the income group. And in my work, we're particularly interested in the low and middle income countries and various impacts on them. So I have a data set that has one row for each country. I'll just make this a little bigger so we can just kind of see this. There's one row for each country. If I scan down the histogram here, there's no shorter rows in here. And then I also have a data set of the Environmental Performance Index, which comes out of Yale, and this has a list of countries. And so if I want to look at my Environmental Performance Index, classified based on the World Income Group, I need to join those two tables together. So I do a join on the World Bank economy and the country, and we've got our lovely join interface. And I can see I've got some mismatches here. And scrolling down, I can see I've got like Bahamas here, and or Bahamas, comma, the Bahamas. And then in the join interface, I can fix these. So like I can just type in Bahamas. And now that's no longer red, and that works. And I could manually go through and identify all the rest of the unmatched and fix them. So this is standard Tableau prep behavior. or we can do these corrections in the join step. Then in Tableau Desktop, we can do join calculations or relationship calculations to deal with that in there. But there are some limitations when we do this. So one of them is that's only computed in that source. And so the impact of that is that those corrections that I've made to match those synonyms aren't available in other sources or tools. I'm just going to move this share window down here. And I saw somebody said, whoa, I didn't know you could do the manual fix like that on a join error table view. Yes, you can. One of Tableau Prep's principles is clean anywhere. So the vast majority of things that we can do for changes, whether it's correction or grouping or so on, we can do in any step in Tableau Prep. But like I was saying here, we can do those changes, but then it's not available if we're building some other data source using that. So for example, if I wanted to join the World Bank data on some data on medical oxygen need, for example, then I don't have that correction available. And also those corrections aren't necessarily visible to our end users because Tableau Prep is just outputting that result of the join or those corrections. And we may need that in order to do data validation. So the solution for that is to create these reusable crosswalk or mapping tables that are going to connect those synonyms. And so this is what a sample table looks like from these two tables. So we have our list of terms from one table. So this is my environmental performance index data. And then we have our list of terms from the other table, like the World Bank data. And then we could just stop here and use this, but typically I will have a merged or matched term as well, which gets me the unique list of this. And it's useful in cases like Curaçao, where we have unmatched values in the case of it exists in one source, but not the other. So I've highlighted here the two different Congos where we've done matching on that, and then down here in row 60 on Egypt for building this up. And I'll demonstrate using this later on in the session. So in building out these tables, what kind of skills do we need? And the first skill we need is attention to detail. And this is something that we all have. The vast majority of us grew up when we were young doing games like this one where we're trying to spot the differences. There's 5 different differences between these two pandas, and we need to find them, for example. And then it also takes time to do this. And I know right now the vast majority of you are not paying attention to me because you're trying to find those 5 different differences. I used this on my wife and daughter, and I watched their eyes just totally disappear and stare at the pandas. So I'm going to give you a couple more seconds to find them. And thank you, Carl. And now I will highlight them. So those are the differences. That's what we're doing when we're doing this kind of matching. So some helpful skills are knowledge of common patterns. And then at the very end of this, occasionally we're needing to do string manipulation calculations. So I'm going to go through some of the common patterns. So one of them is abbreviations. So for example, we've got a picture here of New York City. And New York City may also be written as NYC, NY, NY with periods, NYC with periods, N dot space Y dot as another one. And this is something that we see all the time with place names and so on. Another common pattern is the variation in languages in our data. So looking at Mozambique, these are all different spellings of Mozambique that we might see in our data, and including different accents, different languages, and so on. And then there's variation in terms or even the specificity of terms. So for example, I have an iPhone. So there's one term. The specific model or model name is an iPhone XS Max. And then it's got one of these model numbers. So any one of these model numbers is also an iPhone XS Max. And then depending on where you're looking, there's this thing called a model number, a part number, which is getting even more specific to identify the color and the size of the iPhone, that gets even more specific about that. So any one of these things can be an iPhone XS Max. And we'd want to crosswalk these appropriately. And then there's names that change over time. So here we have Pope Francis, and in the past, he was Jorge Mario Bergoglio. Pardon my terrible Spanish. So names will change over time for people, places, and things. And that's something we often have to deal with our crosswalks when we're working with historical data. Another pattern that we have is where we have the same name for different things. So how many Springfields are there in the United States? Somebody online answered 34. And then if we get a couple more answers of it, somebody says there's 47 Springfields. Somebody else says there's 45 Springfields in the United States. So if we're wanting to look at Springfield, we got to be clear which one we care about. And if we're thinking about Tableau, Tableau will map 25 Springfields by default across the United States. And then another pattern we have is these combined identifiers. So this is a sign that's about an hour and a half drive away from me in Maine, where I live. And I have a Tableau visualization to show this. Let me pull this one up. So here's Maine, and then these are all my different towns that are on that sign. And that's where the sign exists. So we can drive to Sweden and Denmark and Naples and Norway and Paris all in the same day, and still be in Maine. So when we're thinking about these kinds of names, we actually need multiple identifiers to know whether we're talking about Paris, Maine, or are we talking about Paris, France, or Paris, Texas in the United States is another one. So this is where we'll need multiple fields to identify something like country, state or province, county, city or town. Names are another one, first name, middle initial, and last name. However, for example, I grew up in a town with a lot of immigrants from Quebec, Canada, and there's quite a number of like Marie Cody's here. So then we start looking at date of birth as yet another identifier that we need to identify people, but sometimes that isn't even good enough. And then we need yet another identifier to be able to uniquely identify people. So there can be some real challenges when we have these combined identifiers. And then finally, we have the grab bag of everything else. So mistakes on data entry or bad data, typographical errors, and so on. We might have leading and trailing or in between spaces or other non-printing characters in our data, mixed use of capitalization in our data. When there are accents in the data, something may use C or C cedilla, like Mozambique here, or umlauts and non-umlauts and so on. And then we also have changes in formatting. So one source might have some sort of identifier like ABC-123456, and another one might have ABC-123456 without that dash or hyphen, and those are both the same thing. So these are all of our common patterns that we run into as we're working with data, and we need to be able to detect these and work with them. So the process that I'm outlining here is that we're going to review our data, potentially do some cleansing that's obvious there, and then we're going to merge our terms via a union. And then with that, we're going to go through reviewing our data again, identify that most specific pattern, cleanse the data if need be, and then do a match. And then we'll move on from there with our matched and our unmatched data. So I'm going to do an example, just show a demo of this quickly in Tableau Prep. And let's go to this crosswalk that I've built out. So here we have our input and union, and I will expand this out. So we have these two data sets. One of them is population data. So we have a set of facility IDs here, and then for each facility, we've got a couple of rows for a couple of different years with our populations as they've changed over time, whether they've gone up or down. And this data has all, the facility names are drawn from facilities in Zambia, but all the other data is made up that we're looking at here. So we have this set of facilities. And then we also have another data set was actually multiple Excel tables as we're looking at it. And in that data, we've got different table names, and in our different tables, some of them have facility IDs, a whole lot of them don't have facilities. We have a variety of different name formats in our data. And ultimately, we want to be able to join these two data sets together. And we're not just going to join it on this cases file, we're going to join it on our population to other different kinds of cases in the future. So we need that reusable crosswalk. So with that, I typically have this review data step afterwards. And then we want to get because we may have millions of records, but we've only got 38 facilities here, 32 facilities in one source, 38 in another. So we're getting that distinct list of facilities and their facility IDs. So this is a situation where we have kind of a common ID here. I see somebody asked, shouldn't facility ID be text? It doesn't have to be text. It can be a number as well. We can work with that just as easily in prep as if it's text. If it was combined text and numbers, then yeah, certainly we'd want to use it as text. And then the piece that I do here is I set up for this union. And so there's a few different things going on here. What I'm doing is I'm getting rid of any extraneous fields, and then I'm having my raw facility ID and facility, and a merge facility ID and facility. So I'm just duplicating my fields. And so the idea is my raw facility ID is going back to what it is in the original data. And then the merge is what we're going to be working with to match up our different data sets. And then I also add a source field to identify what that comes from, and doing the same thing on this union side, and then do a union of this. So now I have one table that I'm working with, which has a list of all of my facility names in whatever format or structure they are, all of my sources in there, and then also what the original raw pieces are. And then I'm going to go through the first match here. And you might be wondering why we're not doing a join. And I'll explain that. And somebody asked, so your setup is to do 2 dimensions and add a column with a source? Yes, that's what we're doing. And we could add additional data sources to this part here if we had additional data sources that had different terms that we needed to use. Now for matching on ID, so after the union, I've got so the thing that I know is I do have data that has these facility, in some cases, we do have matching facility IDs between my two sources, my cases and my population, and we've got a bunch of null facility IDs in that cases data. So some things may not match. So we know if we've got, like from looking at the data, if they match on ID, that's a perfect match. That's where we normally do a join here. And instead of doing a join to kind of identify this, instead, I'm using a level of detail expression in prep. And this level of detail expression, let me bring up the level of detail expression here, is counting the number of sources that we have for each of our facility IDs. And so that's going to return either 1 or 2. We're doing a count distinct in this case, on our facility IDs. And so we have this value, and then the ones that match are the cases where we have this fixed LOD1 has a value of 2. It matched in both sources. So that we're going to keep that on ID, and then our unmatched, we're going to take a separate stream here and just keep all the ones. And so this way, and then we're sending the good data onto our output here, and then the unmatched data goes on for more matches. So going back to PowerPoint here to kind of look at this. So this is what we walk through here with our matched and our unmatched. And then we'll continue on with our unmatched to get kind of our next most specific pattern of data we can pull, and then keep on repeating this process until we've made all possible matches. And then we're sending everything to a union and then outputting that in different formats that we may want to use. So with this process, we're able to go through these steps, and within Tableau Prep, just to go back and show this, kind of clearly identify what it is we're doing in each step, and what we're matching and unmatching on. And then if we realize like, oh, there was something more specific sooner that we could do, we could insert steps higher up and do that. So I found this way of working, and particularly having the grouping now in prep to work really well for me. So you might be wondering, why are we doing a union instead of a join? And that was actually a question in here. And I will answer that right now. So when we're joining, and this was also a comment I saw in the chat, when we're joining tables, we're going to keep all the columns from A and all the columns from B, and that's going to give us like field 1, field 2, etc. fields, which then we have to either merge those fields or remove those fields. And I find particularly in a multiple step process where I'm having to do this for multiple patterns, that adds this level of complexity. Also, if I'm not totally careful with my data, I can end up with replication in my joints. And so making sure I'm not doing that adds complexity. Another thing with joins is that they only have 2 inputs. So if I'm needing a crosswalk across 3 or more tables, and in one of our data sets, we had to crosswalk across 6 different data sources, and where joins only have 2 inputs, we're just creating all this extra work with all these extra joins, whereas a union, we just have a list of all of our terms. So we're saving on that. And then the other big thing is that when we're wanting to get to same terms, prep doesn't do operations across multiple fields. The grouping and the fuzzy matching and things we're going to demonstrate, or if I want to write a calculation on a field to clean it up, like a replace function, for example, that only works on 1 field at a time. So if we've unioned all of our terms together, I can write 1 calculation or do 1 grouping and see that all together. So just to continue on with my demo here of this. So here I have the grouping on pronunciation. And in this, I will, we've got a little time, so I'll actually just do this, add a separate clean step just to kind of show this here. So in this kit, and I'll just review what I did here. So one of the things that prep doesn't do right now is let us be able to quickly identify what we've grouped and what we haven't grouped. So I have a method for doing that. So my first thing I'm going to do is I have this level of detail expression, which I'm just going to copy and then paste that change over here. And I'll just open this up to see it. So for each of my raw facility values, I'm just counting the source rows in this. And this kind of gives me a, how many do I have in my raw data? And we've got some of them just have one, and then some of them have two because they're matched. Then with this, I can start doing my merging of facilities. And this is where I will experiment and see what works and what doesn't work within prep. So Tableau prep has some different fuzzy grouping. So there's manual selection, spelling, common characters, pronunciation. So I might try like looking at the spelling grouping and see how that works. And we can control in the grouping how much it's going to try to collapse things or making it more sensitive. So minus is more sensitive, plus is less sensitive. So here's where it started, and I can look at this spelling grouping, and like I can see already it grouped two different facilities together that aren't the same. It did catch this one. Those two are the same. It caught these two great. For Tebby Rural Health Center, it looks like by spelling it was matching our rural health center and just picked up a whole bunch of things. So this one isn't working as a grouping. So I can just delete that step, and then I can go here and let's do another grouping. Let's group on pronunciation. And now I can start seeing that, yeah, this is actually working. Oh, this picked up a center. So US American spelling, British rest of the world spelling of center. Kalea sugar, it picked up this, which I happen to know from the data these two go together. Cascal Urban Center, it picked up the Casco and the Cascal. So this is working really well. Mazabuka Hospital Affiliated Health Center, it happened to pick up a lot of other things here. But some of these, actually, these three hospitals go together, but not the hospital affiliated health center. So I can just in this ungroup those values. And then I can say, well, these three I actually want to group. So I've taken Tableau's starting pronunciation grouping, and now I'm about to do my own manual grouping here. And then we can go through and just review the rest of the data. So in this case, this grouping doesn't work. So I can just ungroup those and so on in our data. I think that I actually did all the groupings here. So having done the grouping, now I want to be in a place of keeping my new groupings. That are in here. And so for that, we have a couple more calculations, and I'm just going to demonstrate this here in this one. So I have a merge source count that is doing that same formula of basically of counting our sources, except we're grouping on the merge facility, which is now our grouped data. And so we have values of 1, 2, and 3. So there's my raw source count with 1 and 2, and we can see from cases where I had 1, some of my data have been managed to group because now I have 2 or 3 rows for each of these. Somebody asked what version I'm using. This is 2021.1.4, I think. Yeah, 2021.1.4. And then there's a couple questions about updating later. I will answer that once I've gone through this. And then from this, having these two calculations, then I can do a merge group flag where my merge source count is greater than my raw source count, indicating that my grouping has picked up more rows than the raw data. And then I can split this in two. So one, I'm keeping my new groups. I've added a field here called a match status, saying I've matched on pronunciation, and I'm passing that on to my union up here. And then I have an exclude new groups down here where I'm doing a keep only on the false of my field. And then I can pass that on for more matching. And then having done this on pronunciation, then I can start working on things like, well, let's do my exact matches on name as a kind of next specificity on that. And then I'm down to at the end here, there's some more manual work where I'm dealing with, like, I have in some cases, like if I do, let's go to this one. So like I have Munenga RHC here, and there's also down in here a Munenga Rural Health Center. So I'm using some string manipulation to clean up my data and create things I can match. This is where we might use Tableau's built-in split functions and so on, to just get more and more of our matches and our patterns. So for example, one of the things I've had to do with data like this as we're doing matching is ultimately looking at latitude and longitude coordinates, for example, and matching on that. And if two things are in the same, at the same latitude and longitude, then we can be pretty sure that they're the same thing. So we just go on with this and add our steps as we go. And then finally, we have a final unmatched. We have one row here of Chibouti Health Post that did not match. And then these all get union together here. And in each of these calculations, we've added a match status so we can identify what's going on with this. This is a little pattern of working with prep that I'll do, where I'll do an aggregate step that's just doing number of rows on different things. And then I can put those in a union step and just make sure my number of rows is the same from both my inputs, and just make sure I didn't lose any data along the way. So that's a little count validation in there. And this is something that goes to the people who are asking about automating updates and so on, this is something that in prep, I might append this to the rest of my data or have a separate output that I use, because we can't really do good error checking in prep right now. So what I'll do is I'll output a data source, and then I can use that to build a subscription on to alert me when there's bad data and other data quality issues. So here I'm doing a little bit of cleaning after, this is clean after join, it should be union, to create a unique facility ID out of this, which in some cases I have a unique facility ID, in other cases I have to use the facility name. Also, where we have sometimes multiple names for the same thing. So like in our Cascal situation, it's Casco and Cascal. Identifying those rows can be useful downstream. And then also using another level of detail expression, and there's a lot of different ways we might do this, to just create kind of a coalesced or canonical name for this thing, that even though it's called this in one source and something else in another source, or maybe multiple things in the same source, what's the way that we want to call it? And then from here, we're going to generating our output. And I've got 3 outputs here. that we'll use for different purposes, and I'm going to go into that. So somebody asked, can prep handle slowly changing dimensions? Yes. So the part of the whole point of this flow is to handle that situation. So for example, if I look at this data, here's Mukuyu Rural Health Center and Rural Health Post. If I look at these two fields, it was called South Mukuyu Rural Health Post in 2020. And then in 2021, it's now called South Mukuyu Rural Health Center. And in our output, as we're looking at it over here, if I look at my case data, here's that South Mukuyu Rural Health Center in our data. So we've coalesced that and are able to handle that. So for output, we have one output that is just our merged case data. We have another output that is our merged population data. And this is where we're doing all our field renaming and all of that. And then in this, I've taken that data where I've renamed it and everything, done a full outer join and merged everything together to have a combined output that has all of these and has the replication that happens as well in our data sources. And then from this, we can then build Tableau views. So here I have my population data and my case data, and we can see the little joins on here. This is using Tableau 2021.1, and I'm using the relationships feature introduced last year in Tableau 2020.2. So in my population data, I have my population crosswalk joined with, that I put from prep, joined with my population data. So now I have one row for each of my original population data with that coalesced information of that facility ID and my unique crosswalk facility ID. And then here in my case data logical table, it's a similar kind of thing in my case crosswalk and that union of all of my original data to build out this data source. And then I'm relating them on that unique facility crosswalk ID and the year. In this case, because I have 2 years of data in each of these sources. And with this, I'm then able to really quickly build out views and take advantage of Tableau Prep's or Tableau Desktop's relationships feature to work out different levels of detail between the tables and get my numbers to work accurately within that. And then I'm also able with this in relationships, I can look at what were things called in the original population data source, what were things called in my case data source, and see those side by side, which is really useful in situations where we do have some ability to go upstream and help people to make changes in that data. So this is one of the things with the reusable crosswalks is it lets us keep as much or as little as we want of the information about the matching and how we got there so we can share that out with other people. So with that, I'm going to switch back to this last piece and just talk about some of the different ways we might use these crosswalks. And I'll answer questions after that. So here we have doing a full inner join between our two data sets and our crosswalks. So this works great when our crosswalks are a one-to-one match on our terms. But if data set A and data set B have different grains of detail or levels of detail, then we can run into replication issues or we start needing to build level of detail expressions and so on. And that's where doing the relationships on using relationships in a crosswalk table solves that replication issue. Now, what if our terms don't have one-to-one matching, which was our situation here with these data sets? So in this case, I do that inner join inside a logical table to my crosswalk, or maybe I do that in data prep. And then here's my data set B, and then I can do the relationship between those tables, which is what I demonstrated here. And then we have a situation sometimes where maybe our matching data is more sparse, and it's a case where it's sparse enough that relationships on its own doesn't really work. And in that situation, I'll do my data sets to each of their crosswalk tables and then create a scaffold table that has the full list of values, which I may build out of prep, for example. And then depending on what makes sense, I'll either do a join or a union, join or relationship to that. So there's a lot of flexibility we have in using that for different purposes. So then our last question is, so when do I use prep versus manually building it? And because using prep, we're adding steps and we're kind of doing these operations, mathematical operations on our data. And I find this depends. So my first factor is how many terms am I trying to match? If I've just got like 4 or 5 terms to match or something, I'm going to do that by hand. That's going to be way faster than dragging and dropping in prep. Also, what is our data quality for those terms, and kind of how much is going to match right away? Are we like 90% matching right away and there's 10% not matching? Or is it a case where just everything is not matching? If I've got less than 100 terms I'm trying to match, I'm probably going to do that manually, putting 2 spreadsheets side by side or 2 columns side by side in an Excel spreadsheet and filling that out. That can take a few seconds per to use my brain as a pattern matching tool to figure that out. If I've got less than a couple of thousand terms, one of the things I found in doing this with prep is it works with relatively good data or kind of regular bad data. If the data is really bad or ugly, that time it's going to take to identify patterns might take longer than just manually going through them to identify those patterns within the data in terms of that. If we've got a lot of terms, then there starts at some point, the math starts switching to be like, yeah, doing it in prep works well. And if we've got tens of thousands of terms, there's other tools that have, so there's like Python or R or Alteryx or so on that have more advanced matching, fuzzy matching and cleansing algorithms and more ability to look at multiple matches and so on and work with the data in that way. We may need to do some of that. So with that, I'm going to, so that's talking about using prep to create reusable crosswalk and mapping tables. Now, one of the questions, a couple of different questions about handling data updates. And one of the things with this as a flow and looking at it this way is that we've got if we run this and we have new data, then all the patterns that we've identified will get automatically picked up. Let me just close these out. In here, and our output will get updated, and then anything that's unmatched we can look at, and potentially that would be the place to start exploring. And maybe you're doing like a count of how many unmatched there are, or as a percentage of the total data, and to help you identify at what point do we start looking at that. Another thing in views like this is this is harder to do in prep because prep doesn't have a really good ability to read from a table and write to it. So we typically need to start using some other sort of operation or workaround for this is we can read from our existing crosswalk and then add that as an input. So we can say, okay, these are all the things that I know. That I know match, and then automatically carry those through to the matches and then continue on through everything else. So that's another piece of working with this for new data. So those are updating the crosswalk steps. So somebody asked, how do you create a folder to unhide certain flows like what I'm showing? So this was a feature introduced last year in Tableau Prep. I'm just going to go to my other workflow to demonstrate this. So the thing you do is you just click and drag to select a group of steps, and then you right click and you choose group. And then this creates a grouping step. And then you can color this and add text and description like you can in the other step. And then you can expand that and collapse that. And then also you can remove a step from a group if you need to. It's grayed out right now, I think, because there's only 2 steps in this. So that's that one on grouping. So somebody asked if you end up having to use Latin long to get across the goal line, if you have Latin long for most facilities, might you just start with that? Because it could crosswalk a large number of facilities in one step. That's where my answer is it depends and looking at your data. So in the example I gave where we were looking at Latin longs, we had a number of cases where multiple facilities would get the same latitude and longitude. So just trying to group on Latin long would end up having duplicates that we would need to do further cleansing on. So it's easier to use other things first. The other things with Latin long is that if people are using cell phones to do latitude and longitude, even though our GPS gives us nice little coordinates, in GPS, when we're looking across thousands or millions of records, what is it, like the sort of min max of the error can come out to be a couple of kilometers. So in using coordinates, you end up starting to have to round out your latitude and longitude so you're matching at a sufficient level of precision in doing that. So that's on that one. Let's see here. I answered live on that one. Talked about new data coming in. Another question was about, is there any performance advantage to condensing a flow into as few steps as possible? I'm going to say not that I've found so far, but I haven't used prep on super big data. For us, that's where I'll tend to use other tools, because we have usually when we're getting into bigger data sets, there's a level of complexity there that we need to use other tools on. But one thing to know about prep is it actually resolves when we're building out a flow like this, and we look at these clean steps, like Tableau Prep, when we're in this interactive or design mode, Prep will generate a query to show us the data at this point. It'll generate a query to show us at this point in the joint. If I go and looking back at my grouping, it's generating a query to show us this point in the joint. So we're seeing individual queries. But when we click that run button in a flow, if I've added an output step, what Tableau Prep does is it actually puts together, looks at all of the steps and generates as few queries as it can. And it tries to generate efficient queries. It's not always possible. And so in that, if we're condensing our flow into fewer steps, that's not necessarily going to change the kind of query Tableau's going to generate on our data. And in fact, one of the performance, when we run into performance issues with prep, Sometimes it's really because it's trying to pull everything into as few queries as possible. And those queries are just taking a huge amount of memory on our computer and then swapping out to disk and so on. And that's where sometimes with prep, needing to break out our flows into separate, or a single flow into separate flows can end up having massive performance boosts, is because then we're making each of those queries do a smaller amount of work that can better fit in memory before it goes on to the next thing. So there's that one. So it looks like everything in the Q&A. I'm just going to see if anything's in the chat. Debuilding short character names. Awesome group by pronunciation. So thanks. Also things like putting flow components in a collapsible folder. This was a feature that was introduced sometime last year in prep. So reading when with each new release of prep, in the release notes talk about bug fixes, but there's also a new features in this release piece in the documentation. And that's something I always look at because I learn new things, and Tableau will also put in new features that aren't in the announced new features in that. All right, and somebody asked, can you send out the link, please? I'm going to let Jack answer that.
Yeah, I'm assuming that's the link to the recording of the session, which will be up on Tableau's YouTube channel tomorrow. Is there a regular prep training that we can join? There is the Information Labs Thursday training at 3, which I mentioned earlier, but you may have joined later. I'll quickly put those links in the chat again now. Give me 2 seconds. But Jonathan, whilst I'm doing that, I just wanted to ask, so that was a really great session. Thank you for sharing that. I think that's going to be a really useful technique for a lot of people. But whilst also delivering that, I think you showed off a load of tips and tricks that people didn't know existed in Tableau Prep. So I was just going to say, off the top of your head, other than what you showed there, what do you think are some neat tricks that, or not, I say tricks, I mean features that are in there that people might not necessarily be aware of until they've been using Tableau Prep a lot?
Tableau Prep. Actually, let me switch to my other workflow here. So the grouping is here. Change anywhere. I'm just trying to think of stuff that I do. One of the things I've seen people get, this is just a really basic one, is this group. Tableau will try to bin numbers and dates and the view detail. So this view state, I can say view detail and it'll show me all of those numbers. And then the histogram here is really useful.
We're not seeing your screen at the moment.
Sorry.
That's okay.
I forgot I had stopped sharing. Okay, here we go.
Cool, yeah, I can see it now.
So one of the things that I am constantly running into is replication in data, or I'm expecting to have 1 row per thing, and I've got 1 row per thing for a lot of it, and then something else has 5 rows per thing. Let me go back. Let me go to this one as something. And so, so the thing I was going to show is, like, if I want to see all my distinct values of cases, Tableau Prep right now is automatically binning the data because it's a number. So I can change my view state to detail and see all of those numbers and see that histogram of values here. And then I have the little thumbnail histogram, and I use this all the time to get a sense of my data and what's going on in this data and zoom in on things. So that's kind of a basic thing in prep. We can't copy out of the data grid in prep, which is one of my most wanted features in prep. So the thing that I will do regularly is I'll do a preview in Tableau Desktop, because then in Tableau Desktop, I can build a view on the data as it is here and copy that out and work with it. Another big tip in Tableau Prep for those of you who are new to doing this is I see people who are starting to build flows and they just add a ton of steps and they're doing a ton of changes in each step. And slow down a little bit and take some time to document your changes. You can right click and do the edit color and select a bunch of steps and change the color of them and so on. And use that to usefully describe what you're doing in this. And for me, and particularly with prep, where we can put dozens of changes in a single step, this is one of those places where I will create more steps just so each step is doing less stuff and I can be more clear on what it's doing in there, and not overwhelm myself. Because one of the things in building flows is if I do a good job with building a flow, then I'm going to be asked to do more with that data later on. And so somebody later on is going to have to come back and use this flow again to work with the data. And that person is probably going to be me. And so I'm just helping the future me by taking a little more time now to work with it and figure things out. So this is some of that, like do one thing at a time and do some grouping, color these differently so I can just be clear on what's happening with that. Another thing, somebody had a thing on, so you do a join, and then after you would do a join, you end up, if I have like 20 fields from A and 20 fields from table B, and I do a join, and then I've got like 20 of those fields I want to remove. I will, in prep, I'll very often put a clean step before a join, and remove and rename everything I don't care about before the joins. So instead of do the join and then clean up after the join, I'll do a clean before the join. So that way the join only has the fields that I care about within it. So that's a piece there. And in general, that bit of only keep the fields that you need for your downstream operation is a good practice in prep. So that way you don't end up getting confused later on because you're accidentally carried a unique facility crosswalk ID -4 that you end up joining on by accident. Yeah. And then you're wondering why things happen. So this is another thing for me where after join steps, after summarize steps, union steps, pivot steps, I will often have a clean step just to organize my data. Yep.
Cool.
Yeah.
No, thank you for that.
I can't really like I don't. Yeah, you have
tips and
very
tricks from you as well.
So.
No, it's okay.
Yeah.
No, thank you. There's some really, really useful points in there. And especially documentation, I think, is so key for this work, because as you say, either at some point you're going to be revisiting it or you're going to potentially be handing it over to someone else, and it makes that whole process a lot easier. So yeah, thank you again. I saw there's one question about sort of the error alerts in Tableau Prep, and sometimes it's not really saying what's wrong. I know that's an issue that the devs are working on all the time to try and improve the sort of debugging of prep workflows. But other than what's in there at the moment, there's not really much more information you can get unless you know of anything magical, Jonathan. I'm not aware of anything.
So is it I forget whether it's I forget whether it's the 2021.2 release is improving the error messaging, I think. Is that it? Or was it in 2020.1.4? I
I
forget which
definitely
one.
saw it somewhere recently saying that's coming.
Yeah, so they're working on improving the error messaging, but it's still a case where prep is going to run the flow up until just as part of prep's design. It's more oriented towards in my view, the analyst at the desktop who's preparing the data. So it's going to go as far as it can. And if it sees an error, then it's going to raise the error, which is different from other tools that might try to go through follow through as much of the different paths the data takes, and then may spit out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, a dozen errors on it at once. So we still need to be interactive with that. And Carl Alchin, thank you, Carl, just posted something about, so this was the 2021.1.4 release, the current release of prep. That has some improvements in the error messages. Yep.
Great.
And somebody had asked about a tutorial on this. So there's for at least right now, the video tutorial, watching the video is the way to see this. There is a little extra complexity when we start going into 3 or 4 with this union method. Depending on how clean your data is, if we're going to like 3 or 4 or multiple different sets of terms, some of the calculations have to change a little bit, but the core idea is still here.
Great. Well, thank you so much. You've covered a lot there.
Thanks.
So I really appreciate you taking the time to do that. That is everything from us today. I'm just going to try and share PowerPoint if it's going to let me. Can you see PowerPoint?
Yes.
Is it in presenter mode or is it in the actual mode that it should be? Okay, great.
It's in the, I'm seeing your presentation, the presenter screen.
Better?
Yep.
Okay. I'm not sure why it keeps doing that. But just to remind everyone, in case you missed this at the beginning, there is some free Tableau prep training that the Information Lab run. The next Tableau prep learning path, which takes you through 3 weeks of training, which builds upon the previous week, starts this Thursday on the 3rd of June. So if you'd like to sign up to that, there's a link there. I have put the link in the chat a few times, so quickly scroll back through the chat and grab it if you haven't got that already. We also talked earlier about it'd be great to have some input on future sessions that we run at these user groups. These can be suggestions for us to try and find a speaker to present to everyone, or perhaps you'd like to speak at a session yourself. So please go and fill out that Google form if you've got something of interest or would like to speak. Again, I put the link in the chat, so go and grab that if that interests you. In terms of future sessions, we've only managed to get 2 out this year already, but we're looking to get those back on track with more regular sessions. So I would say look out for August for the next Tableau Prep user group. But otherwise, thank you for joining us today. I hope you've enjoyed it. There are 2 really great sessions from Jonathan and Kate there. As I said earlier, the recording will be up on Tableau's YouTube channel probably tomorrow morning, but that will be shared on my social channels, which are there, and also get an email sent out to the attendees that joined today. But that's all from us. Jonathan, thank you. I will thank Kate. I know she had to shoot off, but and thank you all for joining. We'll see you soon.
All right. Thanks, Jack, and thanks everybody for coming.